Hello, and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. In this adventure, I am joined by Tracy Townsend, a wonderful new friend and climbing partner. Our goal in this conversation is to explore the areas around the rising psychedelic renaissance, both from a personal and a clinical perspective. This landscape is littered with pitfalls and tripwires, as it has witnessed significant cultural battles in our modern collective mapping. While we attempt to be sensitive to the dangers in this adventure, we are also attempting to have the courage to find the treasure hidden behind all these dangers. As always, there are many contexts that are left to be explored, and many perspectives to be held on topics touched upon, which may or may not be thoroughly unpacked. Thank you, and as always, if you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. So to get started, I have interacted some with you on Twitter and read a lot of your tweets and found them really helpful, and I appreciated them a lot. And I wanted to just explore talking about this renaissance of psychedelics, as you said before we started recording, and especially in the realm of clinical uses and treatments and bringing them on board something like a normative cultural use of psychedelics. So that's kind of the framing of the conversation I'd like to go down. And so maybe to start with, the question I would have is, for you, when you interact with somebody, whether it's at work or a family member, someone who doesn't really have any sense of psychedelics beyond just kind of the normal cultural, war on drugs, those kinds of things, where do you start? How do you frame it?
Oh, well, I really try to meet people where they are, but that of course is a very a very kind of limited, it's based on my perception of the other person. So it's on some level, it's very limited based on my interactions with them, and also me just projecting essentially stereotypes onto the person based on their age or their background, where they're from, where they've lived, that kind of thing. When I find that when I'm more at work, say with like colleagues who are, say, another orthopedic surgeon who's middle-aged, and I'll kind of broach the topic. It's funny, I moved to Portland specifically because it is ground zero for psychedelics. And
oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was in fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital for pediatric orthopedic surgery, and this was during peak pandemic, and we had just left Los Angeles. At the time, my husband and I were thinking about returning to Los Angeles before any of this happened, and then so much has changed in the last few years in the landscape. And then Measure 109, I was following that, and I was looking, but I was a little bit constrained with, at the time, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to just continue to do work in pediatric orthopedic surgery because I would like to pursue my board certification, which requires at least 17 months employed in a certain place. So that's kind of as far into the future as we were looking. And so I looked at a job in Miami, I was thinking about Austin. A lot of our friends had moved there. And then this job popped up in Portland, and one of my mentors in Boston was like, kind of knew a little bit about me, and because I put a little bit more of myself out there in terms of sound healing, meditation, psychedelics, at least through my social media, that I left that open during my whole fellowship application, which was a real edge for me because I was a little worried about that. Yeah. But I'm glad I did, because it allowed.
That's courageous. That's cool.
Thanks. It did feel like a real edge for me, because I'm not fully board certified yet, but it's my truth in terms of what these medicines have done. And I really do look at them as medicines. What they've done for me in my own healing, my own journey, they really did save me to stay on the path that I've been on, to be I think there's this misconception where like psychedelics, well, at least I had when I was, and this goes back to your original question, like how do you approach talking about psychedelics with people? Like I had those same misconceptions about psychedelics, or I don't even think I really had when I was younger. The only context I really thought of them in, it was like the Beatles and the 60s and, all the, that whole mini cultural revolution. And, and I would say it was when I was taking a gap year between undergrad and medical school that I actually read Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. And I read about how he would like drop acid in his little house in Silicon Valley, and how it was he talked about how it was instrumental in building Apple. And I was a huge fan of Apple products. Like I loved that kind of that technology and what that company was doing for creators, essentially.
Sure.
Yeah. And
it was Steve Jobs and a movement of maybe creativity that kind of first started to move you away from just kind of a colloquial psychedelics are bad to maybe there's something here worth exploring.
Yes, like there's kind of this, I would say, like, okay, take cannabis or marijuana, whatever you want to call it, like as a plant. It's essentially a plant when you really get down to it, with all of this cultural baggage around it. And then you have like that friend in high school who's a huge cannabis fan, or like I had that very stereotypical friend in high school who literally wore Grateful Dead shirts and like had long hair. He was a total hippie in Northern Virginia at this like science and tech magnet school. And you're like, okay, like, I'm like going to college, I'm gonna be pre-med, don't really want to mess with that because it's a gateway drug.
Sure, yeah.
So,
you're gonna be homeless. Like for me, it was always, well, I'm gonna be homeless in 2 years if I ever choose to do this.
Yeah, you kind of put it in the same class as like heroin, meth, all those other drugs that really do, it's funny, you just like lob it into like umbrella of drugs.
Yeah, because it was, right? Because culturally it was.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't have a lot of friends. Like you're just looking at your social circles and friend groups, and like no one in my friend group did. We certainly experimented with alcohol. Like alcohol was totally okay to experiment with in high school. And even like I had friends' parents, like pretty liberal parents, who would actually like host parties in their basements and be like, okay, everyone spend the night, no one's driving home, agree to be safe, but basically harm reduction approaches, which I'm a big fan of, to allow us to experience essentially what is an altered state of consciousness, which is, I really believe, an innate desire in humans. Like Michael Pollan wrote The Botany of Desire and talks about how pervasive this is in like how universal really it is in cultures kind of all around the world. And so, certainly experiment with alcohol had like a lot of like really what I would classify as like bad trips, if you will, with alcohol, like overdoing it, but it was culturally condoned. It was something that, and then I went to school, I went to University of Virginia, like there's literally, the motto there is work hard, play hard. There's an unofficial mascot, the wahoo, which is a fish that can drink more than its weight in water. And like that's the culture, right? So a lot of drinking in college, too much for sure. And also like that all plays into kind of how I, have walked onto this path with psychedelic medicines.
So really quickly, can we pause that? Because I want to keep going with this line, but I'd like to diverge quickly. And we've drawn this juxtaposition now a little bit with alcohol and these other consciousness altering substances, and maybe adding a little bit of the medical hat, if you will, of like what's going on with these. How would you think about and frame alcohol relative to, say, marijuana relative to psilocybin?
Yeah, so alcohol is, I think of as like, ultimately it's a sedative. And it actually, I would say your state of consciousness on alcohol is actually that of less lucidity, less clarity, like a little, it like dulls, and it's in that category on the path with opioids, really. It's kind of a numbing effect, which can be helpful in certain social situations because you numb yourself to the pain of social anxiety or what have you. And it's, so I'd put kind of alcohol in that class, and everything I would say is governed by your relationship to the substance as well. That's kind of a core principle that seems to be emerging, like this idea of setting, and intention, which like has been shown in the experiments with psychedelic medicines to be like really crucial to the experience. I would say that applies to alcohol as well. That applies to cannabis, anything that you're ingesting that ultimately changes your state of consciousness. So when you're partaking in alcohol, there's nothing, like, I have no judgment around that, although there's a lot of unconscious use of it because it is so culturally acceptable. It's all about like bringing that awareness to it. And same thing for cannabis. I mean, all of these are ultimately derived from plants, if you think about it. But cannabis, I think of actually as, I put it in the same category almost as psychedelics. It's governed by setting and intention, and and there's different ways of whether you ingest it and it's first metabolized through your gut versus inhaling it. Like, there's different experiences there, and then all of it too is governed by your mindset that you bring into it. Like, a lot of people will say like, oh, I don't like cannabis because I get too paranoid on it. I have like, it ramps up my anxiety. And they will kind of say that that's a property of cannabis, but really I like to point out, like, that's actually a property of your mind and what you're bringing to the medicine. Like, medicine is just highlighting that for you, so you need to just get curious about that. Like, just look and witness the thoughts that come up when you are in that altered state, and if you get curious about it, you don't identify with the thoughts too much, it might point you in a direction. It's medicinal in that way, to kind of guide you about maybe next steps forward in your life that you can take to then reduce that anxiety. Because that anxiety is always there. It's just like bubbling up a little bit. It's bubbling up more and coming into the forefront of your consciousness. So the medicine's revealing in that way. And I say psychedelics are much the same. It's like governed by your mindset going into the experience, like where you're doing the experience, with whom you're doing the experience, and then your intention going into, is your intention to get high and escape? Is your intention to work with some deep-seated, childhood trauma? Is it to gain clarity on next steps forward in your purpose in life? Like, it can help you in any of those ways. And of course, reveal things maybe that you weren't. I think the scary part, especially with psychedelics, because they're so powerful and you can't, like, you take a big enough dose in the right setting, there's no resisting. And I think that's actually the appeal of it, because you can only fight with your ego so much. It's like sometimes a forcible surrender, but the what gets revealed to you sometimes is not always what you want to be revealed to you. It's what, but I do believe especially with the right integration, with the right kind of person, I think that part's critical. There is a way to sort of like to reap some sort of deeper lesson there.
Wow, so that was beautiful. So there's so much there that I could jump into. One of the things, but where I'd like to hone in on is this aspect of mindset, in relation to medicine, because I mean, at least in my experience in medicine, that bears out even just in normal Western medicine, and I don't think we take it nearly seriously enough, but it's certainly probably more so the case, I would say, in this kind of setting where you're actually shifting what it means to be a person, what it feels like to be you. So it's it's a deeper level, but there is this way in which our orientation as we approach the taking on board of any substance that's supposed to change something for us physically or mentally actually impacts its level of efficacy and and maybe our experience on it. So there's a way in which, right, like one of the things that I'm still trying to work out is there's obviously the material and the way in which, say, if I take psilocybin, it turns on my serotonin receptors, etc. And that's all well and good. I was having a conversation actually with one of the neurologists at the hospital that I work with, because I brought it up to him and I said, hey, have you read anything about psychedelic research? Do you know anything about it? And he had a very kind of what I would have expect as a classic kind of answer towards it. He was just like, oh, it's a lot of serotonin, and all the data is just subjective, so it's terrible and all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, I mean, that's one framework, but you can't deny that there's, I mean, putting aside the data issue, that there's a way in which this is more than just a material phenomenon that is turning on something in your head. There's also, it matters a lot what your attitude is, and I don't know how to work with and square that all the way. So how do you think about that?
Well, to me, that kind of response is just prototypical mind-body dualism. That is right. Like, yeah, that's the kind of bedrock of the philosophy of medicine, if you will, in Western allopathic, medical models. Yeah. And so, like, and that's what was still taught. What's wild to me is that that's still what is taught in my generation, which I graduated from medical school in 2015. We have, which is, it's just so, I don't want to be overly critical, because I really do believe that all of this is an evolution. Like I truly believe things unfold the way they do in perfect divine order, and that's how we evolve.
Yeah, there's a reason we are where we are.
Yeah, there are no mistakes in this. And so there were, as, birthing out of the scientific, like the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, and just really the power of science as a truth, seeking, tool, really, is, we look at modern society. It's insane when you look at what we've been able to achieve. And yes, there are still major problems in the world that are yet to be solved. And I'm honestly excited about that, because, part of, I think, the excitement of being human in this human experience is solving problems. Totally. But yeah, it's just like, that's just emblematic of mind-body dualism. And so scientists who have been trained in that methodology are going to have a really difficult time with accepting so-called subjective data as being true. But at least where I've evolved in my sort of philosophy of medicine really goes back to a philosophy of medicine that we had back in ancient Greek times, or you can find this, and really you find it all over the world in Eastern medicine as well, which is this concept of, rather than just treating the body as separate from the mind, it's actually, or even, let's say, treating the body in the hopes of healing the mind, like actually going the other direction, like treating mind, spirit, your emotional, mental, spiritual self, and then that will manifest as physical healing. So it's kind of a reversing of what we've seen. And it kind of gets back to this idea I heard about this past week. I think it was like, I was listening to another podcast where they referenced Andrew Huberman's podcast, which I've been tuning into a little bit more, and really love his work. And this idea, I guess he talked about this idea of willful participation in the context of, say, cold plunges or cold therapy, which I'm also a really big fan of. Yes. And so with whether it's whatever material substance medicine that you ingest, like if there is willful participation in that, you will reap a different effect than if there isn't willful participation. All the time I see in modern medicine, actually, patients not engaging with willful participation. They feel victimized to the medical system, like, oh my, or they put them, they're engaging in a victim kind of dynamic where, okay, I'm handing all my power over to you, the doctor, you're gonna tell me what I need, like, oh, my cholesterol is high, I'm gonna take this statin, or, this, I have this pain in my hip, so you're gonna recommend this hip scope labral repair. And it's like all the time I see patients going along with that, even though maybe deep within they kind of are skeptical that it will help them. And then they don't derive the benefits that the doctor think they're going to derive. And then you actually end up seeing a lot of harm being perpetuated, like through that model. So, yeah,
I feel that existentially, like that's.
Oh, I feel it every day in my job. Like, yes. I have, well, especially because so much, like, what I say, like, mental, emotional, spiritual pain manifests as musculoskeletal pain. And I'm an orthopedic surgeon. And I specialized in pediatrics. So I actually have, I see children and adolescents who in their normal state of health should not have back pain, should not have, all these other pains that I see manifesting out of, ultimately, yes, it's lifestyle, behavioral things, but like if you get to the root cause of that, it really is a lot of intergenerational, trauma, which trauma has become this word that has made it into the mainstream and gets butchered, but that's really at the heart of so many of these. And then the patients come thinking, oh, I'm a doctor, I have solutions for them. But all the time I'm having conversations with patients where, like, yeah, I am a surgeon, I have wonderful surgeries in my toolkit that are perfect for certain problems. Like, if you break your femur in a car accident, like, I can put a rod in your femur and you will be walking, like, later that day.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
you
and
will avoid
magic. Like, that's so cool.
It's magic.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I mean, that's part of what drew me to this particular specialty in medicine, because it was one of the areas where I was really interested in psychiatry and neurology when I was in medical school. And what drew me to medicine was really human suffering, like, what is suffering? This is human condition, really wanting to do my part to alleviate suffering in the world. And as I get into medical school, and I mean, it's really an indoctrination, like, more than anything, into a cult. It's really not that different from all of that. Like, I saw all of the ways where we weren't helping people, and like, I was like, okay, that's what drew me ultimately to orthopedic surgery, because I do feel like, that's an area where we really do help. I mean, doctors are all doing their best, but like, there is definitely room in the modern system for evolving past our current conceptions of what health really means.
Yeah. And I think I feel that so much, and it seems to me so much of it is around this issue of dualism, because you might say it's so hard to pick out maybe where things started or where they came from, but moving in the direction of dualism, and not just in medicine, although it comes about, or maybe it's a very good example of where it's happened. Overall, we've moved in this dualistic pattern where one of the things that I say to people now every day in my practice, I work with older people for the most part, who are frustrated with the fact that their bodies don't work very well. And I will say something to them like, well, bodies get old, and as they get old, they break down. And you know what? You got to work with your body, because it's the only one you get. And it's like, it's revolutionary to them. Like, it's like they've not thought about that before. It's like, when I'm having a lifestyle modification with someone, which happens a lot in my practice, I'm counseling them on, hey, maybe don't drink 5 sodas a day, and maybe go for a walk now and then, and this kinds of things. For me to convey to them and get them to understand that this is their body, and they're in this body, and they are constrained to this body and by the limitations of it, it's like they've never heard that before. And I'm like, like where are we if we're trying to do medicine in a way that just we're so focused on, okay, fix this problem, fix this problem, fix this problem, but then the well-being of the person that's in the body is just like, well, I mean, you go see psychiatry or what, or go to therapy or whatever, and then oftentimes the person comes back to me and it's like, well, now they're on 3 or 4 different medications and they're just kind of snowed all the time, right? They're just sedated. And it's okay, well, how do we pursue well-being over health? Like there's a distinction there that I think is really important, that's been totally lost in our culture. Of well-being is not the same as just health. Health is a narrow framework, and you can apply it in different ways. And I'm not trying to denigrate that. It's a good thing.
Mm.
Obviously we want to be healthy, but are we well? And I think for me, and it sounds like for you as well, wellness starts from within. Wellness starts from this, from who you are, where you are. And yes, the behavioral and the lifestyle and all that stuff will play so much of a role in that, but that flows from somewhere. And it flows from the way you're oriented in your own life and the way you're oriented towards yourself and others.
100% agree with that. Like it, to me, well, first of all, like if you're looking for well-being from the traditional, like the conventional medical system, you're just not going to find it. I mean, when I look at, like when I reflect back on my medical education, and a lot of what I think draws people, a lot of students to the field, is understanding pathology and being able to, when somebody presents with a constellation of symptoms, like a lot of doctors are, and you tend to be like puzzle solving types. They love that intellectual stimulation of like all these different symptoms, the different signs, the data from the test, and then bringing it together for a unifying diagnosis. And that's beautiful when it does happen, and it, like, doctors save lives doing this. Absolutely. But I would say that is a tiny cohort of actually the patients who present to the system. That if you're looking to, I've always been excited by scale, like systems-based impact, like really, like how can we impact the most people with a particular intervention or something like that. Like what's the most efficient, like best bang for your buck? Like if you had to wave a magic wand, like what would you do? And like the vast majority, or like I've seen in my experiences, is that the vast majority of patients are presenting with issues that are psychospiritual in nature, and that they are acting as, because their orientation to the self, to borrow terms from the East, like Atman, Brahman, like that, all of these concepts, we don't even have language to really discuss it in our current cultural milieu. But because there is that lack of orientation to self, to other, to your intimate relationships, your ego, your ego identity, your purpose, because there is a lack of that understanding, we will manifest that as physical disease, because we are numbing, distracting, escaping, just not addressing those core issues. And there's so much available now in the modern world to do that, to be distracted by these other pursuits. And at least one thing I've found in my life that I seem to be observing and witnessing and sharing with my friends in my life is that you can with that lack of, at least I was, like when I was in that state of mind, like you can pursue all of these external things that you think are bringing what you are seeking. Like ultimately everyone is a seeker. We're seeking, whether it's pleasure, we're seeking, and avoiding pain, we're seeking validation, social validation, we're seeking, like status, whatever it is, perceived status, like what have you. And there's all these external markers to reflect back to us, like who we are. And you can do that for a while and you will get short-term satisfaction from those things. But ultimately you reach a stage in your life I think a lot of times it happens in your late 20s, early 30s, where you like, it's like that quarter life cliche crisis where you're like, oh, wait a second, I've been achieved, at least in my case, I was achieving. I had gotten into a selective specialty after busting my butt, like I'm getting all this, like, some validation or, having along the way these life experiences in my personal life and reflecting on decisions I made up until that point. And then I got to a point basically where I was like, I should be happy, like that peace, whatever that inner peace that I was seeking, like wasn't coming to me. And that's when I started my meditation practice, because I was listening to, these podcasts, and I was like, okay, like I was coming home and ruminating over, I was an intern and making mistakes left and right that were big hits on my ego. And also working 80 hours a week, like I was under, in some ways, I feel like I was attracted to that pressure cooker environment so that it would actually, it was for my evolution. And so I started my meditation practice, which has been, still is, a game changer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is one of the things that I think sometimes, at least for me, it can be easy to forget, or because meditation, or not emphasize enough, because meditation and mindfulness, it's hard to, I can talk about it all day, but it's hard to put language frames on in the same way that I can put language frames on the evolution of my understanding about philosophy, about spirituality, about religion, just because it's so much of a participatory thing. But as you talked about the participatory before, and you mentioned you're familiar with John Vervaeke at least a little bit, and his 4 P's of knowing. Do you know those? What?
I don't know if I've gotten that far in his series yet. I'm about 10 episodes in.
Cool. Well, I wish I could watch it again for the first time. So I'm somewhat envious of you in that. But anyway, he talks about the 4 P's of knowing from a cognitive science perspective, which is something like there's 4 levels at which we know something. And the first, and maybe the most shallow level, is the propositional. And that's what we do when we're talking about things. It's words, it's download of words from one of us to another in communication, and it's fairly low resolution relatively. And then below that is the procedural, which is knowing how to do something, right? Like you don't necessarily could fully articulate it, but you know how to do it. Say change the oil in a car, do a surgery, right? Whatever. And then third underneath that is the perspectival level of knowing. And it's what it feels like to be there. It's to have the perspective of knowing what it's like to be in the OR, to know what it's like to be driving in your car at whatever. And it's something that can't be contained. Each one of these can't be contained in the one above it, in a sense. And then all of these rest on fundamentally the level of participation. And participatory knowing is knowing a thing because in participating in the thing, it reveals you to yourself, in a sense. And so the example for this is a marriage relationship. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a marriage relationship, but a very close relationship that you have with someone. I think marriage is a good way to talk about it, in that you know yourself because you have participated with the other, and you know each other through yourselves, right? So it's this sense of you can't contain it in all the others. It's revelatory of yourself, and as you participate in your own life, you know it for what it is, in a way that cannot be contained in any of these other levels. And so I say all that to move towards one of the things that has been true in my life, and that meditation and mindfulness has helped me with so much, is to start to participate in my own life. Because moving from the levels of being stuck in my thoughts, being stuck in the propositions, or being stuck in the memories of perspectives or whatever, and moving into a place where I'm actually able to participate in my own sense of being in any given moment. um, I think mindfulness is probably uh, I mean, it's been so powerful in doing that.
Hmm. I mean, what that brings up for me, well, one that brings into mind this concept of embodied cognition, which has come up in other conversations I've had with like kind of groups with mothers and just going like this transition to motherhood, but with a lot of these women who've had psychedelic experiences, or at least are like in this same kind of the same stage of exploration, if you will. And it's such a wild process becoming a mother, because like after having psychedelic experiences, because you're just you are brought into your body and like really realizing the wisdom and intelligence that is the human body. And like really I find where a lot of mothers are struggling in the transition is in this idea of kind of still mind body dualism, being like a lot in the mind and the head, and we conceive of it, feel it here, but then there's this whole like intelligence down in the rest of the body throughout your entire nervous system that comes online, and you're reckoning with that. To go back to what you were saying too about participatory knowing through another, you like in a marriage, for example, or really any intimate relationship, especially a relationship where you can be truly vulnerable with another, which is, if you ask me, like too rare and it's too precious of a thing right now, because I feel like so many of us are walking around in society feeling a lot of fear and, you know, have our guards up. But when you are able to engage in that participatory knowing with someone, there's this like, to use an analogy like or a metaphor of this mirror, this sacred mirror with someone. And so they're able to reflect to you aspects of yourself that would be impossible to observe or see or realize without that other person. And that's kind of going back to this concept of, you know, I think I remember you saying in another podcast of yours where there's this like mycelial, like the metaphor with the mushrooms, and to take it back to psilocybin, is, you know, like if you think of human or conceptualize human consciousness as this mycelial network that's kind of below the earth's surface, and then there are these fruiting bodies that pop up like as an expression, like particular unique expressions of that mycelial network. Like I see that coming up a lot, at least in the psychedelic community, like that just seems to be emerging organically as a cosmology, if you will, or as a, you know, as a like a new if you're thinking of like how religions emerge and like really having a shared mythology, like this idea that you know, human consciousness is the sea, it's like one, it's like the ocean, and then we're each a drop in that ocean, and then we get to reflect to each other aspects of the rest of the sea when we engage in that participatory knowing. Like that's what comes up for me when you say that.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And oh man, so like one of the things, and I don't think it's an accident that it's the mushroom that has that. Um, and it's also like some of the people that, because I play a lot from the Christian worldview, and a lot of what I'm actually kind of straightforwardly trying to do, and I don't know if trying is the right word, because I try not to really try with anything. I just find myself where I am and explore it. But I'm always finding the Christian story, you know, I'll depart from it, and then I turn around and it's behind me again. And so, okay, well, take it from there. And I think there's this, you know, the core of the Christian story at the bottom of it is this idea of agape. It's this, and agape is kind of love that you have for a child when you love it for what it could become. And because you love it that way, it actually becomes what it could be.
Mm.
And I think it's a very, you know, I think there's actually a technical way in which that happens, and it has to do with the orientation of attention, because it is the orientation of attention that is maybe the fundamental action and function and process of the human individual is that we can orient our attention onto things, and because we do that, we change, and the thing we're oriented on changes. And there's a way in which you can do that that's better, and there's a way that you can do that that's worse, and there maybe there's a way in which we can place attention on each other in such a way that we call out of each other the potential of what we could be, that actualizes something beyond that which we can imagine. And it's something like that, I think, is the idea of agape, is that that we take, and I think, to lay my cards on the table, the experiences that I've had with psilocybin have helped me understand that perspectively and participatorily in a way that translates into the rest of my life in a day-to-day way, like deeply. And because you understand, I understand in a participatory and perspectival way that the ways in which we differentiate and separate between each other is superficial. They're necessarily superficial. And therefore, all the ways we get stuck in those and actualize potentials that are much lower and even downward compared to where we have been, is just, I mean, I think that's kind of the technical definition of evil, but I'll stop there. But
well, yeah, participatory knowing. I mean, I think anyone who has experimented, say, and this is why I really recommend anyone who's considering engaging in a psychedelic experience, to begin a meditation practice, just like, and just start playing around with it. Because if nothing more than to have that A/B testing of what meditation is like, psychedelic experience integration, and then what your meditation practice is afterwards. I mean, it's just wild to see the contrast there, and to see, like, because to me, psychedelics, what they can do is give you a reference point, to orient towards, like, if you will. And so, and once you've had that, like, if you have that transformational experience, quite literally transforms the way you engage with the world, your sense of being in the world. It just reveals all of these other modes of consciousness, really. And so something as mundane as, washing the dishes, or, I mean, take the most mundane activity, becomes this incredible, I mean, what I say is like a psychedelic experience. You can take that, like, you can, if you really pay attention in a psychedelic journey to your environment, and then, like, really engage with your environment, that is I say that that's part of the medicine journey, because it brings that way of being in your environment it gives you a reference point for that you can return to at any time in your sober waking state. You don't have to take a hero's dose of something to get there. Yeah, like, and then you said something about kind of like putting this in the context of Christianity, which I think would be an interesting place to go. What that kind of brings up to me, I mean, Christianity is like, the Judeo-Christian culture is the cultural milieu that is most dominant in the United States, for example. And
it's unbelievably, like, I've been working with this recently, like, just to use the word Christian is so bizarre, because you're simultaneously, like, you have somebody like, say, Benny Hinn, who is, kind of a televangelist, and for him Christianity looks something like just material and financial gain or something. And then you have somebody like, and if you stretch it across time, I'm reading St. Maximus the Confessor right now, and you read him, and it's like, man, like, you're talking about unbelievably deep mystical experience and incredible insight into ontology and philosophy, and it's mind-boggling. So it's like, if you're using the same word to describe two experiences of culture and what it means to be a person. It's like this whole person identity thing that is so equivocated. It's been equivocated to death, and it's like, oh god, what do we even mean when we say this? And maybe that's part of the problem. I don't know, but anyway, sorry, that's just a side note.
Well, that goes back to this idea that there is like words are a low resolution way to like really exchange what's going on like in this mind. And then, but then you can engage in dialogos, and like, especially when you start to have some shared vocabulary around these things.
Yes.
Like I grew up, my parents are both from Christian backgrounds. Like my mom was born in late 1950s post-war Korea, and where like, the United States was essentially like a savior kind of, culture that came in and really helped South Korea to fight off, the communists. And then you see like the transformation. I mean, there's no starker like contrast than in the Korean Peninsula for, like what shared mythologies can really do for a culture.
Yeah.
And so my mom, there were Catholic missionaries and who like she grew up outside of Seoul, and then they were like a safe haven for her. She grew up in, not the most stable, loving family structure. And so these Catholic nuns were her safe haven. And then she didn't go on to practice Catholicism, but she is like, her main spiritual, like her spiritual life is kind of governed by, Korean Christianity.
Sure.
Yeah. And then my father grew up in New England, like he was in a small town in Connecticut, was raised Episcopalian. I would say he was largely agnostic in his like spiritual orientation. Like didn't really subscribe to organized religion as it is manifested kind of in most communities, at least at that time, in the 2000s when I was growing up, early 2000s. But I did go to church, and I was good student in church. We ended up going to a Lutheran church just because our closest family friends went to a Lutheran church. And so that's like, I would say that, and that was during my kind of elementary, middle school years when my family was going to church regularly, and I was going to Sunday school and doing all that kind of stuff. And it's so funny, like, I think we don't give children enough credit for like children are full on in sense making of the world. And, you're observing everything. You're just like wild state of observation. And it kind of quickly like becomes really flat, that experience where it's not participatory. Like I think maybe in some other contexts, like kind of more evangelical type of church settings, it is more participatory. And you see like, I don't know, I've seen like videos of some of these services where people are much more participatory, but that was not the Lutheran church, like, and kind of classic more, I would say, like that Protestant Christianity as it's expressed in a lot of settings. But like for me, I do keep coming back to Christianity as well, and the deeper lessons. Like there's the more mystical kind of Christianity, like you've touched on, and really bring like this whole idea of mysticism, really, which you see, and there's like a whole mystical, Sufi mysticism, like in the Islam, like branch. And then there's like obviously all the esoteric practices in Buddhism and Hinduism, and they all seem to be, like oriented and pointing towards the same thing. But we've they've continued to branch out. There's this concept, I don't know if you follow, I follow Balaji Srinivasan, I think is how you say his name, just mostly through my husband, who, we'll have conversations about it. Like I've done some reading in his latest book, The Network State. But it's this idea of like, there's centralization, like decentralization, and then a re-centralization. And I kind of think of it as mirroring the idea of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And I really do feel like we're kind of growing up in a time where we've seen, you talk about like dualism, kind of maximum polarity expression in the human experience. And that's kind of the natural evolution from a relatively more centralized period of time, post-war era to, in the 20th century to kind of like max fractalization or fragmentation with the internet. And then there's going to be kind of new communities that synthesize that are coming along. I think people are yearning for that somewhat. Feels like a yearning, at least in a lot of my friend groups. But I think that's like going to be really exciting to see evolve out of this psychedelic renaissance, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. So wonderful. Let's talk about the actual implementation of this, because I think both of us are on this track where we're intending to become certified as facilitators to take people through these experiences. And we both have medical backgrounds, so we have the Western medical frame. We have also clearly a lot of similarities and understandings of spirituality and some of these other things. And we also have this interest in bringing on board a medication that can open people up maybe to move out of some of this kind of like dualism polarity into something more like a holistic embodied cognition of maybe upward toward wisdom, if you will. So one of the reasons that I want to be involved in doing and maybe on the front end of implementing this is to try to be somebody who explores the space of how do we do this in a way that is embedded, because I think there is real danger to be had in just frivolously participating in psychedelics. I think that's pretty clear and well documented that, if you don't know what you're getting into and you aren't properly prepared, I think like you said, having a meditation practice previously is super helpful, because like taking psychedelics is something like going into a very, very deep meditation very, very quickly. And if you don't understand what that means and how that works and all of those things, it's going to be shocking for you. Also, if you're not prepared to face all the parts of yourselves that are disintegrated, you're going to face them. And so what does it look like as we try to work through an implementation that it seems to me there's some sort of embedded wisdom, at least pathway that can be shown to people in order to participate in this in such a way that it actually leads towards holistic goodness, instead of just, okay, now everybody's on their own.
So yeah, first of all, just to get super practical for a second, yeah, meditation. And then I would also say, in a lot of when you're first learning meditation is a form of breath work, using the breath to return to, that center, that grounded state. When you feel your mind, when you finally witness all of the labyrinths that your mind will wander into. So it's extremely useful to be like, whoa, return with the breath. If you're in, because when you go into a psychedelic experience, what seems to be particularly psychologically potentially, dangerous is when your mind just runs away with some scenario, like, oh, I've lost my mind and I'm never getting it back. I'm not returning back to sober reality. I'm, whatever. There are themes that come up for people like, oh, I've really done it this time or something like that. And that's why it really helps, I think, to have an experienced guide if you are relatively inexperienced with these things. Of course, I kind of say that a lot of us are self-initiated at this point. We've had those bad experiences potentially, or and conversely good ones. And what I keep coming back to is there are whole traditions via indigenous cultures who have been the, the wisdom keepers, really, who show us, okay, what does it look like? And like in this 3D reality. And so I, experimented with some things before I ever sat for my first ayahuasca ceremony, which was 7 years ago. And that was my first like truly transformational healing experience with a plant medicine, psychedelic, what have you. And so this context of a ceremony, and in like, it can be one-on-one too. I've had amazing experiences one-on-one, but it's ceremonial. There's some ritual associated with it. And it's, again, we kind of touched on this, maybe it was in the pre-call or earlier, but this idea of setting and intention being like governing principles of this. And so you have your mindset coming into the experience, and then your setting, which, and then which includes the other souls who are sitting with you. And then there's the intention that you set and actually share in that circle. So there's kind of the more MAPS type of multidisciplinary association for psychedelic studies kind of protocol, where you work with a therapist for, I think, one of the protocols I saw was like you have like 3-hour sessions, and then you have your psilocybin journey where the facilitator is essentially trip sitting for you, like you have a blindfold and headphones with a curated playlist. There's not a ton of engagement, and then there's 3-hour integration sessions. So that's one potential model. And I see, even right now, like there are companies like Mind Bloom that are offering ketamine therapy and, creating kind of one kind of manifestation of what this might look like in, in the early 2020s America. I think and believe that it will, there are kind of multiple routes that are going to evolve in parallel to birth this ecosystem. So there's the medical model that I kind of described. And then there is the kind of religious freedom model where you have entheogenic practitioners who in more of like a church kind of model, sort of psychedelic churches, if you will, if you feel called to that kind of expression. And then there's already all of these underground facilitators who have been working for decades, experimenting and iterating on various kind of ceremonial containers, if you will. And so, and you can read about this, like I point people towards Michael Pollan all of the time. He seems to be the most accessible mainstream author right now, writing about psychedelics for psychedelic naive people who've not had any experiences, but are maybe, curious about it.
And if for anyone watching, if you haven't, there's a series on Netflix called How to Change Your Mind that is a docu-series adapted from Michael Pollan's work, and it's fantastic. It's very, very good.
Yeah, there's all sorts of incredible content now. I love the documentary Fantastic Fungi, where they really feature Paul Stamets. I've been meaning to put together like a resource list of, books, podcasts, all the things that have helped me in exploring this space, because there's a lot of illegitimate work you have to be careful of, for sure. And I think that, and there's legitimate work too. And I think I'm hopeful with this kind of new framework that's evolving here in Oregon that we can increase accessibility as well as safety. It's a fine edge to kind of walk along, and there's lots of lively discussion about how that is unfolding. But I do think that those are two principles to kind of hold on to as all of this evolves.
What do you see as maybe potential pitfalls to be avoided? Say, because one of the things that I think about, and I don't know yet what the parameters will look like. You may know more about this than I do, in terms of actually opening facilities or licensing a facility to be to administer. But I have either possession slash access to facilities that I've thought about trying to open something on my own, or not on my own, but how do we explore that space? What does it look like in terms of things that maybe should be avoided in your mind, that may cause this whole thing to go awry? Because obviously that's, I mean, from my perspective, it seems like that's kind of what happened in the 60s, right? Is we were really moving in a good direction with these, and then, you know, Timothy Leary and Ram Dass kind of went a little too hard, too fast, you might say. And so, besides obviously that, like, don't just start giving it to everyone and spraying it in raves, but like, what kinds of things do you see in terms of trying to implement these models in specific settings that you would say, hey, like, maybe we should be careful with this?
Well, I mean, I have been, since I was accepted into the InterTrek program, have been looking more into the legalization around everything, the language around all of that, the actual laws and regulations. It seems to be, and I'm sure I'll learn more. I start the program next month. I mean, that's a lot of my intention in like entering into the program, is to learn about that side of things. And it seems to be, you know, it will be, you know, you'll be able to access these medicines through a licensed facilitator. So once an individual has gone through, you know, the program itself is sort of licensed, and then once completing the program, you're eligible to apply for a license. One of the eligibility, you know, rules is you have to have lived in Oregon for a minimum of 2 years. So that's kind of, you know, favoring, you know, a locally based kind of that principle, it seems. It will be, you know, the facilitations will occur in licensed facilities. So you have a licensed facilitator who's graduated from a licensed program, and then you have these licensed facilities. So it's a separate license to apply for. And there's been some concern around this regulatory requirement that there is liability insurance for both the schools and for these facilities, and that traditional insurance companies aren't really interested in providing that insurance because it's not currently legal at the federal level, although there, you know, were some news pieces a few weeks ago that saying that the Biden administration was looking to kind of track for, you know, federal or national legalization in 2 years. By 2024, I think I saw. And there certainly is, and there certainly is bipartisan support for this, it seems, because there's been tremendous work done in the veteran community with PTSD. Like, I have a history of that on my, you know, in my family. My dad was in the military. And so, and there seems to be support there, at least on one side of the aisle. And then obviously, you know, there's already been support on the other side of the aisle. Mm-hmm. So I'm hopeful and optimistic, and but there's a lot to be worked out. But there's also a lot of creative solutions being kind of thrown around, you know, as far as the liability insurance piece of it. Like, I talked to a guy who has some legal background, was talking about creating mutuals. And this is where DAOs and decentralized ways of organizing and governance are really interesting, because you can, you know, create, say, a mutual psychedelic facilitators, like say you and I are part of this mutual or this DAO, and we would, you know, we can't get insurance from someone else, but we can insure each other so that, you know, if something were to happen, say you own a facility and your facility burns down or something like that, then I, as part of the group, you know, we'll come together as a community and like fund your recovery from that. So that's really interesting and exciting. I would say it's sort of one of the critical pieces of this is that we do have like a diversity of practitioners who come from all different backgrounds, because what's interesting about the model that's at least evolving here in Oregon is that, as far as I know, at least when I was going through the application process, a lot of my friends have asked me, like, do you have to be a licensed therapist? Do you have to have a medical background? Do you have to have like whatever credential prerequisite? And I don't think you do. It didn't seem that you do. And I think like that doesn't preclude you from being an incredibly an incredibly masterful facilitator who is able to deliver safe, transformative experiences for people's healing. Because like really, to me, the only prerequisite is that you do your inner work. To the extent that you work on yourself, through psychedelic medicines, I would say you have to have some experience, a lot of experience, because like you must plumb the
territory. Don't take someone through it. Like
you have to plumb the depths of your psyche, which is a scary AF place.
Yeah.
Go there, like live out your version of hell,
yes.
and then return. And then you're able, that only then, like, I feel like, I knew 7 years ago when I, had my first like therapeutic experience that this is the way. But I was nowhere, and I wanted to pursue this at some point. But, I also like deeply recognize how I wasn't even close to being able to hold space for someone else. Like it generated a lot of fear in me, and that was like a healthy fear to recognize.
And I might just plug in really quickly. This is actually, I think one of the ways this is really cool is that this is what agape is, because agape is this way in which it has to do with courage. It has to do with you placing attention and coming into someone's space with them and helping to hold them, and because you are not shying away from the fear, the anxiety that is presented to the person, because you're in it with them and you're not shying away from it. It almost infuses them with the courage to be able to face it themselves, and thus glean, defeat the dragon and take its treasure, as you will.
I like that. That was like a little bit of Jordan Peterson in there.
Yeah.
I did his baptism meeting, I listened to it, and it was incredible. Like I think again, going back to like what are the requirements for becoming a facilitator? I mean, one is doing the work yourself with these medicines and excavating and exploring your own psyche, and two is really tapping into that frequency of agape, like holding the container with love and meeting this person, this so-called other, like in this divine space, or you see past the ego, identity, facade, and into that person's divinity, really, their soul, and just holding that frequency, which takes a lot. Like it's not for the faint of heart, especially when you've seen what these ceremonies can, especially in group settings, can unfold with. There's a lot that can come up because people, and then there's also just the physical purging that can happen. There's like letting go of all of that kind of the self-conscious pieces of it, and just meeting in that meta space with someone or some other people. That's like kind of, it'll be interesting. It's still so new right now in Oregon, how it's all unfolding. But I also feel like, timelines feel like they're collapsing, and this is just coming down the pike so much faster than I ever thought it would, when I started looking into this stuff years ago. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I suppose we ought to probably wrap it up. I think we're near our time frame, but thank you so much for joining me. This has been a pleasure.
Oh my gosh, it was totally a pleasure. We should do it again. It was really fun, and yeah, it could make it like a regular thing. We just touch base, especially like within this context of kind of psychedelics in Oregon.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to have you back sometime.